Kiara, a bright but reserved black 12-year-old, is forced to navigate the murky waters of foster care when she lands in the home of Mrs. Thompson, a racist white foster mother with a stern reputation. As Kiara settles into her new, rigidly controlled life, she begins to sense undercurrents of cruelty masked by discipline. Will she unravel the dark secrets of this seemingly respectable household before it's too late? Kiara had always been a bright spark. Even after life's cruel hand had snatched her last remaining relative, her grandmother, away from her, her hope had not dimmed. At just 12 years old, she found herself navigating the complexities of a world too vast and harsh for a girl her age, as she entered the foster care system. The social worker's car pulled up in front of Mrs. Thompson's house on a bright September afternoon. Kiara peered out the window, clutching the small suitcase that contained her worldly possessions. The house, a large Victorian with a neatly trimmed hedge and a pristine walkway, seemed welcoming from the outside. Mrs. Thompson, a widow who had been fostering children for over 20 years, was reputed in the community for her strict but supposedly fair approach to child rearing. As Kiara stepped onto the porch, Mrs. Thompson opened the door. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her glasses sat low on her nose. "You must be Kiara," she said with a nod, more a statement of fact than a welcome. There was no smile, no warmth in her voice. Kiara hesitated but moved forward, crossing the threshold into what would be her new home. The first few days passed in a blur of new rules and expectations. Mrs. Thompson ran a tight ship, and every hour of the day seemed scheduled and rigid. The other children in the house, all younger and white, followed the routine with robotic precision, and it quickly became apparent that any deviation was met with stern reprimands. Kiara tried her best to adapt, to fit into the mold Mrs. Thompson enforced. Yet, it seemed that the same rules didn't apply equally. Her vibrant, colorful clothing was deemed too flashy. Her music, a connection to her cultural roots, was too loud. Slowly, Kiara began to feel the creeping tendrils of isolation wrapping around her. She ate her meals quietly, the joy of food dampened by the cold silence of the dining room. As weeks turned into months, Kiara's bright spirit dimmed. The community's respect for Mrs. Thompson meant that nobody questioned her methods. Neighbors smiled and waved when they saw the children playing in the yard, blind to the subtle but pervasive undercurrents of discrimination that flowed beneath the surface of daily life. One particularly chilly evening in November, as Kiara lay in her small, unadorned room, she wrapped a shawl, a final gift from her grandmother, around her shoulders. She thought of the stories her grandmother used to tell her, stories filled with warmth, laughter, and lessons of resilience. Tears welled up in Kiara's eyes as she clutched the shawl tighter. She felt a deep longing for a place where she could be herself, where she didn't feel the constant weight of judgment. In that moment of solitude, Kiara made a silent promise to herself. She would not let this house change who she was. She would keep her grandmother's spirit alive within her, hold onto her joy, her music, her color. Somewhere out there, she believed there was a place for her, a place where she would be loved and accepted for who she truly was. Kiara fell asleep with tears drying on her cheeks. Kiara's introduction to Mrs. Thompson's home, draped in the guise of strict routine and structure, quickly unraveled as a challenging ordeal marked by differential treatment. With each passing day, the racial undertones that colored her interactions with Mrs. Thompson grew more pronounced. The contrast was stark between the warm embrace of her late grandmother's home, filled with love and acceptance, and the cold, regimented atmosphere she now faced. The differences extended beyond the mere discipline. Kiara noticed how her belongings, her clothes, the few cherished books she brought along, and even her small collection of music CDs, were often scrutinized and disparaged by Mrs. Thompson. "We have to keep things nice and proper here," Mrs. Thompson would say, casting a disdainful eye over Kiara's vibrant attire as if the bright colors clashed with the muted tones of the house itself. Kiara's room was at the end of the hallway, smaller and less furnished than those of the other children. Where the others had walls adorned with posters and windows dressed with cheerful curtains, Kiara's window bore a plain, threadbare fabric that barely kept out the light, much less the creeping sense of isolation. Her bed was a creaky frame with a thin mattress, a stark reminder each night that she didn't quite fit in this household. The other children, all younger and white, seemed oblivious to the subtle jabs directed at Kiara. They played with toys that were never described as cheap or tacky, their laughter echoing through corridors that felt increasingly suffocating to Kiara. At meals, Mrs. Thompson often praised their manners and decorum, while finding fault with Kiara's every move, from the way she held her fork to the pace at which she ate. Attempts to bond over shared activities were marred by continuous corrections and comments aimed at Kiara. "Let's try to keep up with the others," Mrs. Thompson would chide during homework time, even though Kiara often finished first and with better accuracy. It wasn't just the coldness in Mrs. Thompson's tone that stung, it was the implication that Kiara, despite her efforts, was always a step behind, always out of place. In these moments, Kiara felt the weight of her otherness pressing down on her. Each comment, each comparison, stripped a layer from her once resilient armor. The realization that her race might be a factor in Mrs. Thompson's treatment of her began to sink in, leaving her feeling both vulnerable and indignant. Yet, amidst the unwelcome environment, Kiara found small ways to preserve her identity and dignity. She began to tuck away her favorite items, keeping them out of sight to protect them from Mrs. Thompson's disparaging remarks. In the quiet moments before sleep took her, she would listen to music through her headphones, the rhythms and lyrics a balm to her fraying spirits. As Kiara lay in her bed one night, a plan began to form. Perhaps, she thought, if she could find a way to show her worth, to prove her value beyond the prejudices that seemed to define her here, she could carve out a space for herself. Little did she know, the opportunity to do just that would soon present itself in an unexpected way, setting the stage for a confrontation that would change the course of her stay in Mrs. Thompson's home. Kiara's days at Mrs. Thompson's house grew increasingly isolating as she found herself subjected to a separate set of rules, seemingly designed to magnify her differences and segregate her from the other children. For minor infractions that went unnoticed when committed by the others, like laughing a bit too loudly during a game or hesitating to respond immediately when called, Kiara was scolded and labeled disruptive or disobedient. Mrs. Thompson, under the guise of maintaining order, began to use Kiara's cultural background as a scapegoat for this harsh treatment. She criticized the way Kiara spoke, her enthusiastic expressions, and even the style of her hair, linking these personal traits to stereotyped and unfounded ideas of propriety and behavior. "We must all try to fit in and not draw too much attention to ourselves," Mrs. Thompson would admonish, her words slicing through the air with a chill that seemed to target Kiara alone. The other children, absorbing the cues from Mrs. Thompson's demeanor, began to mimic her behavior, either by excluding Kiara from their games or whispering about her when they thought she couldn't hear. The dining table became a battleground where Kiara ate her meals under the scrutiny of Mrs. Thompson's disapproving gaze, her every bite monitored, her posture constantly corrected. In her room, her only sanctuary, Kiara felt the weight of her isolation. It was here, in the small, stark space she was given, that she wrestled with her confusion and hurt. Why was her vibrancy, a trait so cherished by her grandmother and her friends at school, now a source of contention and punishment? Why did her cultural heritage, which she had always held with pride, suddenly become something she felt she had to hide or diminish to avoid further rebuke? One particularly difficult evening, as Kiara attempted to join a group of children watching a movie in the living room, Mrs. Thompson pointedly turned to her and said, "Perhaps it's best if you spend the evening in your room, Kiara. We need a bit of quiet tonight, and you tend to disrupt that, don't you?" The comment, though softly spoken, was sharp enough to cut the air, and Kiara felt the sting of rejection as the other children shifted uncomfortably, none daring to meet her gaze. Retreating to her room, the isolation cemented itself around her. As she sat on her bed, the silence of the house around her felt oppressive, a stark contrast to the vibrant life she remembered with her grandmother, where music and laughter had filled their home. It was in these quiet moments, with tears threatening to spill over, that Kiara's resolve began to harden. She couldn't change Mrs. Thompson's views, but perhaps she could find a way to bridge the gap with the other children, to show them she wasn't so different after all. The next day, Kiara made a small but brave decision. She took out her drawing supplies, a set of colorful pencils her grandmother had given her, and began sketching in the common playroom. When one of the younger children hesitantly approached, drawn by the array of colors, Kiara invited her to join. "Would you like to draw with me?" she asked gently. To her relief, the child nodded, and soon a couple of others joined. For a brief afternoon, Kiara felt a flicker of connection, her art creating a bridge that words had failed to build. The children laughed and shared stories as they drew, and Kiara found herself guiding their small fingers to create shapes and forms. However, this rare moment of camaraderie was short-lived. Mrs. Thompson soon entered the room, her eyes narrowing at the scene before her. Without a word, she sent the other children away, reprimanding them for not finishing their chores before playing. The shared space was once again divided. That night, as Kiara lay in bed, the day's events replayed in her mind. She realized that these moments of outreach, however small, were acts of defiance against the unfairness she faced. They were her way of maintaining her identity and sense of self in an environment that sought to suppress it. And while Mrs. Thompson could control many aspects of her life in the house, she couldn't stop Kiara from finding small, meaningful ways to connect and assert her presence. Determined, Kiara decided she would continue to reach out, to share her culture and joy whenever she could, even if it was just in fleeting sketches or whispered stories. In doing so, she hoped not only to challenge the barriers Mrs. Thompson put before her, but also to remind herself and the others that beneath their skin, they shared more similarities than differences. This silent rebellion became her quiet resistance, her way of navigating the complex landscape of foster care while holding on to the rich heritage that Mrs. Thompson so misunderstood. In the confining environment of Mrs. Thompson's home, where Kiara felt every moment of her day regulated and scrutinized, it was a breath of fresh air to discover a friend in Alex, the neighbor's child. Alex lived just next door, and from his bedroom window, he could see the corner of the yard where Kiara often found herself relegated during playtime. Over time, he noticed the subtle yet consistent differences in how Kiara was treated compared to the other foster children. Curious and empathetic, Alex began making small gestures of friendship towards Kiara. It started with a wave from his window, which Kiara shyly returned. Soon, Alex found a more tangible way to connect. He began leaving books and mixed CDs, with notes tucked inside them under a loose board in the fence that separated their yards. "Thought you might like this," read one note, attached to a book of poetry about hope and resilience. Another note, accompanying a CD, said, "These songs always cheer me up. Hope they do the same for you." Kiara cherished these gifts, which became her lifeline, a means to momentarily escape the oppressive atmosphere of the foster home. Each book and each song allowed her to traverse worlds far beyond her immediate reality, into realms where fairness, courage, and kindness prevailed. Music and words became her sanctuary, helping to preserve her inner light that Mrs. Thompson's harsh demeanor constantly threatened to extinguish. The secret exchanges deepened into a quiet yet profound friendship. Sometimes, late in the evening, Kiara and Alex would whisper to each other through the small gap under the fence, sharing their thoughts about the book they were reading or discussing the lyrics of a song from the mix CDs. Alex became not only a friend, but a confidant, someone who saw Kiara for who she truly was, not the distorted version Mrs. Thompson portrayed. One evening, as the sunset cast long shadows over the yard, Alex passed a small journal through the fence. "Write down your thoughts," he suggested. "It helps me when I feel stuck." Grateful, Kiara began to fill the pages with her feelings and experiences, the act of writing providing a therapeutic outlet for her emotions and a record of her endurance through challenging times. Their friendship, though hidden from the prying eyes of Mrs. Thompson, was a powerful affirmation for Kiara. It reassured her that she was not alone in recognizing the unfairness of her situation. More importantly, it reminded her that kindness and understanding could exist close by, just on the other side of the fence. This connection not only fortified her resilience, but also subtly shifted her perspective, reinforcing her resolve to stand firm against the adversities she faced daily under Mrs. Thompson's roof. Through Alex's friendship, Kiara gained the strength to continue fighting for her dignity and worth, armed with the knowledge that her experiences were seen and validated by someone she had come to trust and value deeply. The delicate balance of Kiara's secret friendship with Alex was shattered one brisk autumn afternoon. Kiara had just slipped through the side gate to return a book to Alex, a thoughtful collection of short stories about friendship and courage. As she tucked the book into its usual hiding spot under the fence, a sudden noise startled her. She turned to see Mrs. Thompson looming in the doorway, her face contorted in anger. "What are you doing?" Mrs. Thompson demanded, her voice icy with fury. Kiara, caught off guard and frightened, could only stammer a half-formed explanation. Mrs. Thompson marched over, snatching the book before Kiara could react. "I've told you about taking things that don't belong to you," she hissed, misinterpreting the situation completely. Without waiting for Kiara's protest, Mrs. Thompson dragged her back into the house. Her punishment was swift and severe. Kiara was confined to her room for the weekend. Meals slid through the door like she was a prisoner. All her personal items, including her beloved books and music CDs from Alex, were taken away. Unknown to Mrs. Thompson, this harsh reaction did not go unnoticed. Alex's parents, Mr. Daniels, had been gardening nearby and witnessed the entire exchange. The sight of Kiara's obvious distress and Mrs. Thompson's disproportionate anger raised serious concerns. Mr. Daniels had always sensed that something was off with the strict Mrs. Thompson, but this was the first concrete sign of what might be happening behind the closed doors of the foster home. Concerned for Kiara's well-being, Mr. Daniels decided it was time to take action. He approached his fence, where he quietly observed Mrs. Thompson's stern demeanor as she patrolled the yard, ensuring Kiara remained isolated in her room. The image of Kiara's frightened face was etched in his mind, fueling his resolve. That evening, Mr. Daniels made a call to the local Child Protective Services. He reported what he had seen, expressing his fears that Kiara was being unfairly targeted and punished. His voice steady but urgent, he detailed the incident, requesting an immediate check on her welfare. The call sparked an investigation that would soon bring the hidden realities of Mrs. Thompson's house into the glaring light of scrutiny. Meanwhile, Kiara sat alone in her small, stark room, feeling the walls close in around her. Yet, even in her isolation, there was a flicker of hope. Alex's friendship and Mr. Daniels' concerned gaze earlier that day reminded her that she was not entirely unseen or forgotten. This thought, small and fragile, was enough to keep her spirit from breaking completely as she awaited what she hoped would be a turning point in her bleak living situation. As Mr. Daniels processed the distressing incident he witnessed, his concern for Kiara's safety compelled him to seek more information. The confrontation had revealed a side of Mrs. Thompson that he suspected was not isolated to just one harsh incident. He began reaching out to other community members, initiating quiet conversations about Mrs. Thompson's long tenure as a foster parent. Casually, yet deliberately, Mr. Daniels asked his neighbors about their observations and experiences with Mrs. Thompson. Slowly, a troubling picture began to emerge. Several community members shared hesitations they had previously dismissed or felt uncomfortable addressing. They recounted stories they had heard or small incidents they had witnessed that, when isolated, didn't seem conclusive enough to act upon, but collectively painted a stark portrait of a potentially deep-seated issue. One neighbor mentioned how a young boy of Hispanic descent, who had briefly been under Mrs. Thompson's care, was often seen doing more chores than the other children, his presence at neighborhood gatherings markedly less frequent than his foster siblings. Another neighbor recalled seeing a black foster child who always seemed to wear long sleeves and pants, even in sweltering heat, which they now regretfully speculated might have been to cover bruises. These conversations revealed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. The accounts varied, but the underlying themes were consistent and deeply troubling. Racial bias and unusually harsh punishment seemed woven into the fabric of Mrs. Thompson's caregiving. Emboldened by these discoveries, Mr. Daniels organized a meeting with a small group of concerned neighbors. They decided to collectively approach the local child protective services. Together, they filed a formal complaint, providing statements that documented everything they knew and suspected about Mrs. Thompson's treatment of her foster children, particularly those of color. The formal complaint triggered a community investigation. Social workers began conducting discreet inquiries, interviewing other foster children who had cycled through Mrs. Thompson's home, reaching out to schools for records and observations, and speaking with other foster families about general practices. The gravity of the allegations prompted careful review of Mrs. Thompson's foster care license and her history with the agency overseeing foster arrangements in the area. Back in his home, as Mr. Daniels followed up on the investigation's progress, he felt a grim satisfaction that at least the wheels of justice were beginning to turn. Meanwhile, Kiara remained largely unaware of the growing storm outside Mrs. Thompson's walls. She continued to navigate her daily life under Mrs. Thompson's strict rules, her spirit buoyed unknowingly by the community's rising advocacy on her behalf. Mr. Daniels watched her from afar, hoping that soon the investigation would bring a change that might free Kiara from the oppressive environment she was enduring. As the days grew shorter and the chill of winter began to seep through the walls of Mrs. Thompson's strict household, Kiara's sense of desperation reached a boiling point. The relentless scrutiny and isolation had worn her down, each day feeling more oppressive than the last. In her heart, a plan began to form, a plan to run away, to escape the unbearable environment that stifled her every breath. She couldn't see another way out, couldn't imagine enduring another day under Mrs. Thompson's harsh gaze. One evening, under the faint glow of the moonlight, Kiara whispered her plan through the small gap beneath the fence to Alex, her voice trembling with both fear and determination. "I can't stay here anymore, Alex. I have to leave," she confided, her words heavy with resolve. Alex, hearing the desperation in Kiara's voice, felt a surge of panic. He understood her pain, but the thought of Kiara out there alone, without protection or a clear destination, terrified him. "Kiara, please wait," he urged, his voice earnest, trying to pierce the darkness between them. "Running away could be dangerous. It's cold, and you don't know where you'll end up. Let me talk to my dad again. Maybe there's another way." The conversation was fraught with tension. Kiara, feeling cornered and helpless, struggled between her impulse to flee and the sensible pleas of her friend. Alex, desperate to ensure Kiara's safety, promised to do everything he could to expedite the community's efforts to intervene. Inside her room, Kiara paced back and forth, wrestling with her thoughts. The idea of running away into the unknown was daunting, yet the thought of staying felt increasingly unbearable. She packed a small bag with essentials, a few clothes, the journal Alex had given her, and a photo of her grandmother. Each item was a reminder of why she needed to find a better life, one far away from the suffocating control of Mrs. Thompson. Meanwhile, Alex lay awake, worried about Kiara's safety. Early the next morning, he shared his concerns with his father, Mr. Daniels, who had become increasingly involved in rallying the community's support for Kiara. Realizing the urgency of the situation, Mr. Daniels decided to take immediate action. He called the social services, stressing the critical nature of Kiara's circumstances and the potential risk of her running away. The community's pressure and the heightened concerns for Kiara's welfare catalyzed the social services into faster action. They scheduled an emergency intervention, planning to visit Mrs. Thompson's house within the next 24 hours. As Kiara lay in bed that night, her bag hidden under her bed, she was unaware of the efforts unfolding on her behalf. The hours ticked by, each one drawing closer to a critical intersection of decisions that would determine her fate. The tension of what the following day might bring hung heavy in the air, a mixture of fear, hope, and the desperate longing for a semblance of freedom and safety. The tension that had been building in the community reached a critical point early one frosty morning, as the sun barely crested the horizon. Social workers accompanied by police officers approached Mrs. Thompson's home. The urgency of the situation had compelled them to act swiftly, fueled by the concerted pleas of Alex's father and other worried neighbors who feared for Kiara's safety. As the official vehicles pulled up in front of the neatly trimmed lawn, Kiara, who had been quietly preparing for her escape, peeked out from behind the curtains of her small room. Her heart raced as she saw the figures in uniform approach the front door. Fear mingled with a burgeoning hope. Perhaps this was the rescue she had been yearning for. Mrs. Thompson, caught off guard by the early morning visit, answered the door with a facade of bewildered innocence. "How can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a flicker of concern. "We've received several serious allegations about the welfare of the children in this home, particularly concerning Kiara," one of the social workers explained, her tone professional but firm. "We need to speak with you and Kiara separately to understand the situation fully." The presence of the police underscored the gravity of the visit, making it clear that this was no routine check. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the sight of the police cars and the growing commotion. Mrs. Thompson's well-maintained facade began to crack as the eyes of the community were now upon her, watching intently. Inside, Kiara was escorted to one of the police cars to speak privately with a social worker. With trembling voice but a newfound strength, she recounted her experiences, the unfair punishments, the isolation, and the subtle but persistent racial discrimination that tainted her daily life. Each word lifted a little of the weight she had been carrying alone. Meanwhile, Mrs. Thompson was questioned in her living room, her responses becoming increasingly defensive. "I've only ever enforced discipline in this house," she claimed, but her justifications sounded hollow against the backdrop of Kiara's poignant testimony and the mounting evidence gathered by the community. As the investigation unfolded in full view of the neighborhood, whispers circulated among the gathered crowd. Many expressed shock, having only seen Mrs. Thompson's stern but seemingly fair demeanor. Others exchanged guilty glances, regretting their silence, realizing that their passive acceptance had perhaps enabled her behavior. The confrontation revealed Mrs. Thompson's true character to the community, her ability to manipulate and control not just the children in her care, but also the community's perception of her. The public nature of the inquiry stripped away her ability to hide behind the respectability she had cultivated, exposing the underlying cruelty of her actions. By the time the social workers concluded their initial investigation, it was clear that changes were imminent. Kiara watched from the backseat of the police car, the early morning light now fully breaking over the horizon. A mix of relief and sorrow washed over her as she realized that this day marked the end of her ordeal with Mrs. Thompson, but also the beginning of a new, uncertain journey to find a true place to call home. After the morning's dramatic events, Kiara found herself, for the first time in many months, crossing the threshold into a home where the air was charged with warmth and acceptance. Alex's family had agreed to provide a temporary foster care placement for her while social services worked on finding a long-term solution. This arrangement was facilitated quickly due to the urgent nature of Kiara's situation and the immediate need to remove her from Mrs. Thompson's care. Upon her arrival at Alex's home, Kiara was greeted with gentle smiles and open arms. Alex's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Daniels, showed her to what would be her room, a cozy space filled with soft blankets and a window that looked out over a flowering garden. It was a stark contrast to her sparse accommodations at Mrs. Thompson's house, and for the first time in a long while, Kiara felt a surge of hope. The Daniels family was mindful of the trauma Kiara had endured. They gave her space to adjust, allowing her to set the pace for her integration into the family. Meals were communal and lively, filled with conversations that Kiara was encouraged to join at her own comfort level. Slowly, she began to participate, her voice growing steadier, her laughter more frequent. Alex was a constant presence, a bridge to this new world of familial warmth. He introduced Kiara to family traditions, like movie nights and board games. These simple activities, devoid of any pressure or expectations, allowed Kiara to experience the normalcy of family life that she had missed. Each shared experience with Alex and his family chipped away at the walls she had built around herself. The Daniels also recognized the importance of Kiara continuing her therapy sessions, which had started while she was still at Mrs. Thompson's. They arranged for her to see a therapist who specialized in trauma and racial identity issues, ensuring she had professional support to process her past experiences and to reinforce her sense of self-worth. Through these sessions, Kiara began to understand and articulate the racial prejudices she had faced, not as reflections of her own value, but as injustices that she had courageously endured. This understanding brought new layers of healing, as Kiara learned to separate the cruelty imposed upon her from her identity. As weeks turned into months, the initial temporary arrangement began to feel more like a permanent solution. The Daniels expressed their willingness to have Kiara stay with them as long as needed, even broaching the possibility of making the arrangement official. For Kiara, the idea of being part of a family that not only acknowledged but celebrated her identity was a profound shift from her past experiences. This period of adjustment and healing in Alex's home marked a significant turning point for Kiara. She was not just surviving, she was thriving, bolstered by an environment that nurtured her rather than sought to change her. The laughter, the shared meals, and the quiet nights under the roof of a caring family knit together the fractured parts of her world, promising a future where she could finally be free to be herself. The consequences for Mrs. Thompson were swift and severe following the revelations of her behavior. Legal proceedings were initiated by Child Protective Services, bolstered by the testimony of the community and the evidence gathered during the investigation. The legal actions culminated in Mrs. Thompson losing her license to foster, effectively ending her tenure in a role she had misused for years. The court's decision sent a clear message to the community: such prejudiced and abusive behavior would not be tolerated. As Mrs. Thompson faced accountability, Kiara embarked on a transformative journey. She continued her therapy sessions, which became a cornerstone of her healing process. With the guidance of a skilled therapist, Kiara worked through the layers of trauma inflicted by her foster care experience. She learned coping mechanisms and gradually began to reclaim the self-esteem that had been eroded under Mrs. Thompson's care. The most empowering moment for Kiara came when she was invited to speak at a community event organized to promote awareness about issues in the foster system. Standing before a crowd of neighbors, social workers, and local leaders, Kiara shared her story with poise and depth. Her speech highlighted not only her personal struggles, but also the broader systemic changes needed to protect children in foster care. She spoke of the importance of cultural sensitivity, the vigilance of communities, and the crucial role of supportive and loving foster homes. Her words resonated, leaving many in the audience moved and motivated to advocate for change. Kiara's impact was immediate and profound. Proposals for better training for foster parents, especially in cultural competency and anti-discrimination practices, were put forward. Kiara's courage in sharing her story catalyzed a renewed effort to scrutinize and improve the foster care system in her community. Amid these developments, Kiara found a new sense of belonging with Alex's family. The Daniels had not only provided a safe harbor during her storm, but had come to love Kiara as their own. The discussions about adoption, which had started as tentative conversations, became serious plans. For Kiara, the prospect of becoming an official part of the Daniels family represented the hopeful closure of a painful chapter and the joyful beginning of a new one. Kiara sits in the garden of Daniel's home, looking up at the stars. Each star seemed to twinkle with possibilities and promises of the future. Surrounded by the love and support of Alex and his parents, Kiara felt a profound gratitude for her new life. The trauma she endured would always be a part of her story, but it would not define her. Instead, she stood ready to step into a future that was crafted with love, supported by understanding, and shining brightly under better stars.